Picture this. It is just after dawn, somewhere off the Carolina coast, in the spring of 1718. You are the captain of a merchant sloop, hold packed with sugar and indigo, headed home to England after a long, profitable season in the Caribbean. The sea is glassy. The wind is soft. You have permitted yourself, for the first time in weeks, the small luxury of hope. Then a sail appears on the horizon. Not one sail. 4. The largest of them is a 3-masted frigate, a warship by the look of her, carrying, you count, some 40 guns. She flies no colours. She simply comes on, black hull cutting the swell, the smaller sloops fanning out on either side, like wolves working a wounded deer. You know, before anyone speaks, that you will not outrun her. You know, before anyone fires, that you will not outfight her. You have 12 men. You have 6 small cannon, none of which have been fired since you took command. And then, at the top of her mainmast, a flag runs up the halyard and snaps open in the wind. It is black, a field of pure black, and beneath it, a second flag, narrow, blood red, snapping in the same wind. You have never seen these particular colours before, but you know what they mean. Every captain in these waters knows what they mean. The black flag says, surrender, and you will live. The red flag says, resist, and no quarter will be given. And in that instant, before a single shot is fired, before a single word is exchanged, you make the calculation that every merchant captain in the Atlantic world will make over and over again in the space of just under 2 years. You strike your colours. You surrender the ship. You have just been captured by Edward Teach, the man history remembers as Blackbeard. And this, the sail on the horizon, the reputation that arrives before the man, the surrender without a shot. This is not a story about a pirate who was stronger than everyone else. This is a story about a pirate who understood something the great naval powers of Europe did not. That in war at sea, in that particular corner of the 18th century, terror could do the work of powder and iron. This is the story of how, in less than 2 years, one man captured somewhere between 2 and 4 dozen ships, depending on which surviving records you trust, and how the overwhelming majority of those captures happened without a broadside ever being fired, and how he did it by turning himself, deliberately and with almost theatrical precision, into a monster. To understand Blackbeard, you first have to understand the peculiar historical moment that made a man like him possible. In 1713, the great powers of Europe signed the Treaty of Utrecht, ending what English speakers called Queen Anne's War, and what most of the continent called the War of the Spanish Succession. 12 years of fighting were over. And with the peace came a problem that no one in London or Madrid or Paris had quite thought through. Because during the war, England had licensed thousands of private captains as privateers, legal pirates in effect, men authorized by the Crown to prey on French and Spanish shipping in exchange for a share of the plunder. It was a cheap and effective way to wage economic warfare. It also produced, by the end of the war, a generation of experienced fighting sailors with no jobs, no pensions, and only one marketable skill. They did what unemployed armed men have always done. They kept working. They just stopped asking permission. Between roughly 1715 and the mid-1720s, the Caribbean and the American seaboard entered what historians would later call the Golden Age of Piracy. On the island of New Providence, in the Bahamas, a shallow, defensible harbour, conveniently placed astride the shipping lanes running out of the Gulf of Mexico, a loose republic of pirates took root. At its height, the Bahamian pirate community may have numbered more than 1,000 men. They elected their captains. They drew up written articles that divided plunder in shares. They flew, as a matter of principle, a flag that no legitimate government had ever recognized. Into this world, sometime around the year 1716, walked a man calling himself Edward Teach. Here is the first place where the historian has to stop and be honest with you. We do not know, with certainty, where Blackbeard came from. The most common account gives his name as Edward Teach, born in Bristol, England, around 1680. Contemporary sources in the Carolinas often wrote it as Edward Thatch. Other documents give Thash, or Tack, or Drummond. Some historians have argued Teach itself was an alias, chosen to keep his family respectable, by some accounts, from being tarred by his infamy. Recent archival work by the historian Bayless Brooks, published in 2015, has argued for a Jamaican connection and a family with real property. Older biographies place him firmly in Bristol. The truth is that his origins are genuinely uncertain, and any narrator who tells you otherwise is filling in the blanks. What we do know is this: by 1716, he was sailing under Benjamin Hornigold, the most influential of the Nassau pirate captains, a former privateer who, notably, refused to attack English shipping on the grounds that he was still, in some sense, a loyal subject of the crown. Under Hornigold, Teach learned the trade. He commanded a captured sloop. He proved competent enough that when Hornigold retired from piracy in late 1717 and accepted the king's pardon, his men followed Teach instead. And then, on the 28th of November, 1717, roughly 100 miles east of the French colony of Martinique, Teach did the thing that would make him. He captured a ship called La Concorde. La Concorde was a 3-masted French frigate, built around 1710, roughly 250 tons, owned by the slave-trading merchant René Montaudoin of Nantes. She had begun her career as a privateer in French service, been sold, been reacquired, and by 1717 was on her third voyage as a slave ship, carrying 516 captive Africans on the Middle Passage from the West African port of Ouidah, which the French called Juda, toward Martinique. By the time Teach's 2 sloops appeared on her horizon, La Concorde was in no condition to fight. 16 of her 75 French crewmen were already dead of scurvy and dysentery. Another 36 were confined to the sick bay. 61 of the enslaved Africans below decks had died in passage. The ship carried, at that moment, 14 mounted cannons. Many others had been removed to make room for human cargo. She was, in the language of the sea, a wounded animal. Teach fired 2 warning volleys. Captain Pierre Dosset surrendered without a fight. The pirates took the ship to the small island of Bequia, in the Grenadines. They put the French crew and the surviving Africans ashore. They kept the ship's surgeons, carpenters, pilot, cook, and cabin boy, some by choice, most by force. And then Teach did something that tells you a great deal about the mind of the man you are dealing with. He kept the ship. He renamed her Queen Anne's Revenge, and he added guns. By the time she was finished, Queen Anne's Revenge carried, in the best modern estimate, roughly 40 cannons. That is the armament of a Royal Navy frigate. That was, in the Western Atlantic of 1718, quite possibly the most heavily armed private vessel afloat. The name itself was a message. Queen Anne had been the last Stuart monarch, dead since 1714. The reigning king was George I, a German-speaking Hanoverian whom many old privateers, particularly those with Jacobite sympathies, regarded as a foreign usurper. To name a pirate flagship Queen Anne's Revenge was to make a small, sharp political point. It was also, some scholars have suggested, a nod to Blackbeard's own possible service in the Royal Navy during Queen Anne's War. Either way, the ship was, from the moment of her renaming, a piece of theatre, and so was her captain. A quick note before we continue. If any of this, the ship names, the dates, the specifications, the tangled family trees of the Nassau Pirate Republic, has your attention, I have put together a companion document for this channel called the Black Flag Codex. It is a plain language, source-cited reference guide to the real people, real vessels, and real events of the Golden Age of Piracy. And it is entirely free. The link is in the description below, and the QR code will appear on screen for a few seconds now. Save it. It will make everything we do here easier to follow. We have one contemporary description of Blackbeard, and it comes from a book published in 1724, 6 years after his death, under the name of Captain Charles Johnson. The book is called A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates. Its author is, to this day, unknown, Some scholars have argued it was Daniel Defoe writing under a pseudonym. Most now doubt it. What is clear is that Johnson, whoever he was, had access to court records, newspaper accounts, and probably to men who had actually sailed with the pirates he described. His description of Blackbeard is the source of almost every image you have ever seen of the man, and it is worth quoting the substance of it carefully. Teach, Johnson tells us, was tall and powerfully built. His beard was jet black and grew, unchecked, up to his eyes. He plaited it into small tails, tied with ribbons, and turned them back over his ears. Across his chest he wore a bandolier from which hung 3 braces of pistols, 6 pistols in all, ready to hand. Under his hat, going into battle, he stuck lit, slow-burning matches, the same twisted hemp cords a gunner would use to touch off a cannon, so that his face appeared, in the smoke and confusion of boarding, to be wreathed in fire. Now, some skepticism is in order here. Johnson was writing for a paying audience that wanted its pirates monstrous. His portrait of Blackbeard is almost certainly embellished. There is no independent contemporary confirmation of the lit matches in the beard. It is possible, even likely, that some of the more theatrical touches were exaggerated after the fact, or invented outright to sell books. But here is what saves the account from being pure fiction. Johnson's Blackbeard behaves, throughout his career, in a way that is entirely consistent with a man who understood the value of terror. He shot one of his own officers, Israel Hands, under the table one night, Johnson tells us, for no reason other than to remind the crew who he was. When asked why, he reportedly said that if he did not now and then kill one of his men, they would forget who he was. Whether or not that specific incident happened as described, it fits with everything we can verify about how he ran his ships and how he presented himself to his prizes. Because Blackbeard's method, at sea, was this: he did not want to fight. A pirate captain in 1718 had a very simple economic problem. Every broadside he fired cost him powder, shot, damaged rigging, and risked killing the very crewmen and passengers he needed alive to sail his prizes into port. Every hour spent in combat was an hour a Royal Navy sloop of war might arrive over the horizon. The ideal capture was the capture that never involved a shot, and the way you achieved that was to make the alternative, resistance, look like suicide. So Blackbeard cultivated the beard, and the pistols, and the burning matches, and the flags themselves. And the flags are worth pausing on, because the famous design attributed to him in modern retellings, the horned skeleton toasting the devil, spearing a bleeding heart, is almost certainly a later invention. The earliest surviving illustration of it dates from well after his death, and there is no contemporary evidence he ever flew it. What contemporary sources actually describe him flying is quieter, and in a way, more chilling. A plain black flag, and alongside it, a plain blood-red one. The black flag was the standard pirate signal, and its message was universally understood in these waters. Surrender now, and we will spare your lives. The red flag was the intensifier. It meant no quarter. It meant, if we have to fight for this ship, no one aboard walks away. That was the calculation he offered every captain he approached. And in the overwhelming majority of cases, the captain took the deal. In the spring of 1718, Blackbeard decided to run this calculation not on a single ship, but on an entire city. On the 22nd of May, 1718, his flotilla, Queen Anne's Revenge and 3 smaller vessels, mounting somewhere between 60 and 70 guns in total and carrying perhaps 300 pirates, arrived off the bar of Charleston Harbour, then still commonly called Charlestown, the wealthiest port in the southern British colonies. He did not attack. He simply took station across the harbour mouth. Over the course of the next 6 days, he captured, by the best surviving accounts, between 5 and 9 merchant vessels. The number varies from source to source, as they attempted to enter or leave the port. Not one of them, so far as the record shows, offered serious resistance. Among the passengers he captured was Samuel Wragg, a member of the Governor's Council of the province, along with his young son. Blackbeard sent a boat ashore under a flag of truce with a demand. He did not want gold. He did not want the town. He wanted a chest of medicines. Why medicine, exactly, is a small mystery. Contemporary sources are vague on the specifics. Later writers have speculated, sometimes crudely, that the crew was suffering from venereal disease. Others have suggested more mundane causes: dysentery, malaria, ordinary shipboard infection. Whatever the reason, the demand was clear. If the medicine was not delivered, Blackbeard promised, the hostages would die and he would send their heads ashore, one by one, in confirmation. Governor Robert Johnson had no navy in the harbour capable of driving the pirates off. He agreed. A chest of medicines worth, by one contemporary estimate, several £100 sterling, a considerable sum, was gathered and delivered. Blackbeard released the hostages, stripped nearly naked, but otherwise unharmed. He sailed away. The city of Charleston had been held to ransom by a private individual, without a single cannon fired ashore. Nothing quite like it had happened in the English-speaking world since the buccaneers of the previous century. It was, in the language of the London newspapers that carried the story, an act of pure audacity, and it would prove to be the high watermark of his career. Now we have to slow down and be careful, because the story of what happened next is where the legend of Blackbeard begins to swallow the man. On the 10th of June, 1718, less than 3 weeks after leaving Charleston, Queen Anne's Revenge and one of the smaller sloops, Adventure, ran aground while attempting to enter what was then called Topsail Inlet, modern Beaufort Inlet, on the coast of North Carolina. Queen Anne's Revenge could not be freed. Adventure, attempting to pull her off, grounded as well. Both ships were lost. The question of whether this grounding was accidental has been debated by historians for 3 centuries. In his deposition, taken after the fact, the sloop Adventure's former captain David Heriot stated flatly that he believed Blackbeard had grounded the ships on purpose, as a way of dispersing a crew that had grown, by that point, to more than 300 men, and keeping the bulk of the plunder for himself and a chosen handful of officers. Modern archaeological work has tended to support this reading. In 1996, a private research firm called Intersal Incorporated, working with maritime archaeologist David Moore, located a wreck in about 28 feet of water, roughly a mile off Fort Macon State Park. Subsequent excavation, conducted by the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, has recovered more than 300,000 artifacts, including 24 of an estimated 30 cannons, from what is now identified, on the balance of evidence, as Queen Anne's Revenge. The site tells a story of a ship abandoned in orderly fashion, with valuables removed and the hull left to the sea. That is not the pattern of a panicked stranding. It is the pattern of a deliberate one. Whatever his intent, in the days after the grounding, Blackbeard did 2 things. He marooned somewhere between 17 and 25 of his crewmen on a small sandy island offshore. They were rescued, later, by Stede Bonnet, the so-called gentleman pirate, and he sailed north with a picked crew and most of the plunder straight to the town of Bath, in North Carolina, where he did something remarkable. He surrendered. The King's Pardon, first proclaimed in September 1717 by George I, offered a full pardon to any pirate who surrendered to a colonial governor by a set date, provided he ceased his piratical activities. Blackbeard accepted the pardon from Governor Charles Eden of North Carolina. He appears to have married locally. The sources are, again, uncertain, and settled, briefly, into a strange kind of retirement in Bath. It did not last. Within weeks he was back at sea, operating out of a hidden anchorage at Ocracoke Inlet, taking prizes again and, by some accounts, negotiating a sort of unofficial protection arrangement with Governor Eden. This last point is disputed. Blackbeard's biographer, Robert E. Lee, writing in 1974, argued that Eden was probably corrupt. Other historians have pushed back, noting that the primary evidence is thin. What is clear is that Blackbeard's presence at Ocracoke, on the doorstep of the tobacco colonies of Virginia and Maryland, was intolerable to Virginia's governor, Alexander Spotswood. Spotswood had no legal authority to act in North Carolina. He acted anyway. In November 1718, he outfitted, at his own expense, and probably in violation of colonial law, 2 hired sloops crewed with sailors from HMS Pearl and HMS Lyme. Command was given to Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Pearl. Their orders were to find Blackbeard and kill him. They found him on the morning of the 22nd of November, 1718, anchored inside Ocracoke Inlet. What followed was one of the most vicious close-quarters actions of the Age of Sail. Maynard's sloops, which mounted no cannon, ran aground in the shallow water while Blackbeard's Adventure, a different vessel from the one lost at Beaufort, raked them with a broadside that killed or wounded more than 20 men. Maynard then did something clever. He ordered the surviving members of his crew below decks, so that when Blackbeard's men boarded the apparently crippled sloop, they walked into an ambush. Blackbeard and Maynard met face to face on the sloop's deck. According to the surviving accounts, none of them impartial, they fired pistols at one another. Blackbeard was wounded, but kept fighting. He and Maynard crossed cutlasses. Maynard's blade broke against Blackbeard's guard. A sailor came up behind Blackbeard and struck him across the neck. He fought on for several more minutes, receiving, by late account, 5 pistol wounds and roughly 20 cuts from blades before he fell. Now, and this is important, the story that Blackbeard's headless body swam 3 times around the ship before sinking is a later legend. It appears in Johnson's General History in 1724 and has been repeated, embellished, ever since. There is no contemporary evidence of it. It is folklore, grown up around a man whose real death was quite grim enough. Maynard cut off Blackbeard's head and hung it from the bowsprit of his sloop and sailed for Virginia with it swinging in the wind. The body was thrown into the Sound. 16 of Blackbeard's surviving crewmen were captured and taken back to Virginia. 14 were convicted at trial in Williamsburg the following spring. Of the remaining 2, one, a passenger named Samuel Odell, proved he had been aboard by accident and was acquitted. The other, Israel Hands, escaped the noose on a technicality. He had not been at Ocracoke, and the pardon he had accepted months earlier still covered him. The rest were hanged, and their bodies left in gibbets along the road out of Williamsburg as a warning to any sailor who might be tempted by the trade. He had been an active pirate captain from the capture of La Concorde to his death at Ocracoke for approximately 12 months. The full timeline of Blackbeard's career, every captured ship we can name, every disputed date, every archaeological find from the Queen Anne's Revenge site, along with the sources they come from, is laid out in the Black Flag Codex, that free companion document I mentioned earlier. If you have not grabbed it yet, the link is still in the description, and the QR code will come back up on screen now. It is genuinely useful. It is the reference sheet I wish I had when I started reading about this period. Blackbeard's real career lasted a year. His posthumous career has lasted 3 centuries and shows no sign of ending. The single most important source for that afterlife is the Johnson General History of 1724. Almost every pirate movie you have ever seen, and almost every children's storybook, traces some of its DNA back to that book. The eye-patched, cutlass-waving, parrot-shouldered stereotype of the pirate, much of it Johnson's invention, or at least Johnson's amplification. Blackbeard, in particular, has been reinvented, generation after generation. He appears as a magical villain, complete with a bone-decorated Queen Anne's Revenge that spits Greek fire from its bow, in the 2011 film Pirates of the Caribbean, On Stranger Tides, a portrayal drawn loosely from Tim Powers's 1987 novel of the same name. He appears as a tragicomic, oddly sympathetic figure in the recent television series Our Flag Means Death. He has been played on screen by, among others, Robert Newton, Ian McShane, and Taika Waititi. Every one of these versions borrows something from Johnson's 1724 portrait, and every one of them takes further liberties. What tends to get lost in all of it is the strategic intelligence of the real man. The historical Blackbeard was not, so far as we can tell, especially bloodthirsty. Court records and depositions taken from his prisoners repeatedly note that captured crews were released unharmed, sometimes even courteously. There is no confirmed instance, in the surviving record, of Blackbeard personally murdering a prisoner. What he did was construct, deliberately and with real craft, a public persona so terrifying that resistance became irrational. He weaponized his own reputation. He turned the black flag and the smoking beard and the 6 pistols into a form of psychological artillery, one that saved him powder, saved him men, and saved him time. This is why, when we say he could capture entire fleets without firing a shot, we are being almost literal. At Charleston, in 6 days, he took as many as 9 ships and held an entire colonial capital to ransom. And the only shots fired appear to have been a handful of warning volleys across the bows of merchant vessels that were, in any case, already surrendering. It was one of the most efficient campaigns of maritime coercion in the history of the age of sail. It was carried out by a man with roughly 300 followers, 4 small ships, and a beard. There is a temptation, watching a story like this from a distance of 300 years, to admire it, to see Blackbeard as a kind of dark genius of branding, a man who understood, before the phrase existed, the concept of a personal image. And there is something to that reading. He did understand it. He was very good at it. But it is worth remembering, at the end, what the performance actually cost. It cost the 516 captive Africans on La Concorde, who were traded, briefly, from one form of bondage to another when the pirates seized their ship, and were then abandoned on a small island in the Grenadines, to be recollected and delivered onward into slavery. Their names are almost entirely lost, their voices are absent from every source. It cost the merchant seamen, hundreds of them, over the course of Blackbeard's short career, who were stripped, terrified, and set adrift on wrecked or borrowed vessels along a coast where a bad storm meant death. It cost the hostages of Charleston, held for 6 days in the harbour, while a governor scrambled to gather medicines, and merchants prayed the pirates' patience would hold. It cost the 17 or so pirates marooned on a sandbar at Beaufort Inlet by a captain who had decided they were no longer useful to him. It cost Robert Maynard's men, killed and wounded at Ocracoke. It cost Blackbeard, in the end, everything. The Golden Age of Piracy did not last long after him. Within a decade of his death, the colonial navies and admiralty courts had broken the back of the pirate republic. The great pirate captains, Bartholomew Roberts, Charles Vane, Stede Bonnet, Calico Jack Rackham, died in battle or on the gallows. The black flags came down. The trade lanes reopened. The Atlantic became, once again, a place of merchants and warships. But the image Blackbeard built, the smoking beard, the black flag, the sail on the horizon that meant the end of everything, that image never quite came down. It hangs there still, in every film and every children's book, in every plastic cutlass sold at every Halloween. A performance so effective that it outlived not only the performer, but the entire world that made him possible. He captured ships without firing a shot. He captured, in the end, something rather larger. He captured the imagination of the world, and he did it with almost nothing. A little powder, a little rope, a little smoke, and a flag, somewhere off the North Carolina coast, at Beaufort Inlet, in 28 feet of water. 24 of Blackbeard's cannons still rest in the sand. Divers have been raising them, one at a time, for the better part of 30 years. There are 6 left. They will come up, eventually, but the wreck itself will stay where it is. Broken timbers, black with age, held together by the mud and the sea. A quiet grave for a very loud man. The tide moves over it, the light shifts. And on some evenings, the old fishermen along the Outer Banks will tell you, though of course they are joking, mostly. On some evenings, when the wind is right and the fog closes in, you can see a shape out there on the water. 3 masts, a black hull, no colours flying, just a sail on the horizon, just a shape, coming on,